Everyone called Angus the lucky one, the only person capable of making Elliott ruthlessly suppress his own primal instincts just to love him. That top-tier alpha would always tilt his chin up in absolute arrogance. So what if Angus is a beta? He is the only one I love. Yet, the flawless illusion of their 7th year was ultimately shattered by the arrival of a so-called fated Omega. Pulling that delicate youthful Omega into his embrace, Elliott declared, "In the end, I still need an heir." To completely liquidate the collapse of a 7-year marriage, it took Angus exactly 7 days and nights of shifting light and shadows. On the morning of his departure, the brilliant sunrise pierced the floor, to ceiling windows like shards of shattered gold. With absolute, chilling composure, Angus pulled the tie tight around Elliott's neck and wished him a safe trip. Only this time, there was no longer that familiar, devoted promise, "I'll be waiting for you to come home." Main text. The warm amber sconces cast a mosaic of light and shadow down the dimly lit corridor of the private club. Angus didn't wait blindly in their empty villa like he had for the past 7 years. His footsteps muffled by the thick wool carpet, he steadied his breathing and stopped silently before the carved wooden doors of the penthouse suite. To avoid hurting his beta partner, Elliott always chose to endure the most agonizing period of his cycle alone here. Angus lowered his eyelashes, a tender, heartbroken light softening his eyes. He took a deep breath, ready to surprise the man he loved. The suite was bathed in a quiet, warm, toned calm. On the massive king-sized bed, the snow-white goose down duvet was tangled like a crashing wave. Hovering just above the fabric was an unnatural, shimmering heat distortion, the residual, feverish aura left behind by a top-tier alpha's rut. Following the faint, smooth jazz drifting from the end of the hall, Angus stepped onto the spiral staircase leading to the rooftop terrace. The rooftop was completely submerged in the amber glow of the setting sun, draped in a soft, languid filter. Angus stopped within the warm shadow cast by a Roman pillar, his eyelashes lowered, quietly observing the surreal scene unfolding before him. Countless fragmented golden motes of light, thick and sweet as honey, danced joyfully in the air. They drifted like early spring willow catkins or warm fireflies, softly illuminating the silhouettes around them. Yet, within this shower of golden light, a deep, viscous, dark red aura, rich as a ruby, rolled sluggishly, dominantly entangling, and devouring those golden motes. This was a bizarre spectrum completely alien to the world of Betis. That sweet, shimmering golden dust radiated from a delicate boy curled tightly into Elliott's side. He looked so devastatingly young, the edges of his soft hair haloed in gold by the sunset. "So, Elliott, finding your fated Omega at 30, how does it feel?" The soft, warm breeze carried the idle, teasing voices of friends into his corner. Used to just grit his teeth through those 3 days. This time, he completely surrendered to it. "I bet has already forgotten about that ordinary beta waiting at home." Elliott leaned back into the warm, orange velvet sofa, his long fingers swirling a wine glass. A languid warmth gathered around his eyes, and a soft, indulgent smile played on his lips. He carelessly tossed the empty glass onto the thick wool rug, the impact producing a heavy, muffled thud. "Don't talk nonsense." Angus pressed his back gently against the smooth wood paneling. His breathing was impossibly light, incredibly slow. His gaze dropped to the sliver of ambiguous, warm light spilling across the floor. Elliott's low voice was like a cup of warm black tea, carrying a soothing frequency, yet the words he spoke laid bare the most calculating reality. "So what if Angus is a beta? Hez the only one I love. An Omega makes getting through a rut easy, sure, but that's all it is. The only reason I'm keeping him around is that I'm 30 and I need an heir. My darling, after all, can't give me one." The dark red phantom surged like a tidal wave, tenderly wrapping around the boy who was gazing up at him with utter adoration. The boy gave an obedient, delicate nod. The teasing cheers from his friends swept through the air like soft feathers. "So obedient. You're his fated Omega. Even if Elliott marks you completely, that beta will never know. Once you're marked, Elliott's pheromones will belong exclusively to you. What if he finds out?" Elliott's long fingers traced the rim of a wine glass. Under the warm light, the curve of his smile remained gentle, yet it carried an undeniable, absolute authority. "Then it'll come for all of you." It felt as though the air had been put on slow motion. The soft background music rippled like water. The boy carefully pinched Elliott's fingertips, the corners of his eyes flushing a fragile pink. Older brother. I'm a little scared. Elliott let out a soft chuckle, his thumb gently tapping the tip of the boy's nose. He tilted his head back, his Adam's apple rolling in the warm light as he swallowed a mouthful of red wine. Then he slowly lowered his head, pressing his lips against the boy's. Boom. The dark red and golden motes of light detonated instantly around them, like a breathtakingly brilliant silent firework display, painting the entire terrace in a dreamlike glow. The man who always swore it was Angus or nothing was right at this moment lost in the sweet, youthful taste of someone else. Angus remained standing quietly in the shadows. His fingertips turned a stark white as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a blister pack of white pills. His fingers slowly closed around it, gripping tighter and tighter. He couldn't feel any pain. The air around him simply felt unnaturally light. He turned around and traced his steps back down the sunlit corridor, his gait flawlessly steady. As he passed a polished metal trash can, he lifted his hand slightly. His fingertips parted. The blister pack, carrying every last one of his desperate, pathetic prayers, plummeted into the absolute dark. 3 days slipped away in quiet tranquility. In the afternoon, the sunlight scattered across the villa's living room like shattered gold. Angus looked at the voice call request on his phone screen. With a light tap, he switched it to a video call. After several long rings, the screen lit up. Elliott was wearing a soft, pure white bathrobe, leaning back against cloud like pillows. Despite his best efforts to appear composed, the fine sheen of sweat at his temples, the faint flush under his eyes, and the barely perceptible heat, warped distortion framing the edges of the screen all screamed of the agony he was enduring. "Baby, did you miss me?" Elliott's fathomless eyes were overflowing with an inescapable tenderness. "I miss you too. Just wait a little longer. I can come home tonight." Angus' gaze swept quietly over the tiny screen. Sunlight filtered through his phone, illuminating his own face and highlighting the serene calm in his eyes. In the bottom left corner of Elliott's camera view, the edge of that snow-white silk duvet was rippling with an incredibly faint, yet unmistakably rhythmic frequency. There was no wind in the air, yet Angus felt a scorching beam of light, pierce straight through to his core, reducing 10 years of tangled, rotting deadwood to absolute ash. His eyes curved into sweet crescents, a pure, flawless smile gracing his lips. "You look less miserable than you used to. Are the symptoms lighter this time around?" Elliott's eyes flickered, but he quickly wrapped his lie in an even softer tone. "I switched to a stronger suppressant. It's much better. Baby, I haven't fully recovered yet. It's okay over video, but if you were right here in front of me, if I caught your scent, I would lose my mind. Be good. I'll be home tonight and I'll bring you a gift to make it up to you. I am a beta. I don't have a scent." Angus' voice was as feather-light as a falling leaf, carrying the gentle ease of utter release. Cutting the call, Angus turned his head to look out the floor, to ceiling windows. In the backyard garden, massive clusters of forget-me-nots bloomed recklessly under the blazing midsummer sun. The pink of the new buds tangled with the mature ocean blue, swaying in the breeze like a gentle sea. Once, they had stood before this very sea of flowers and promised eternal love. Now washed in the sunlight, Angus finally understood. No flower blooms forever, and there is no such thing as eternal love. It was all just the natural, ordinary cycle of life and death. The phone screen lit up with a soft chime, a notification from the Differentiation Research Center regarding his transformation drug physical. For half a year, desperate to fill the void of his alpha having no air, he had willingly endured agonizing pain to test this drug. The gland at his nape had just begun to run hot. Under the drug's influence, his dormant biology was fighting a grueling battle to awaken. He had even started to see those shimmering motes of light floating in the air. But right now, under the warm sun, all of that had come to a full stop. Angus calmly tapped confirm. He didn't need the pills anymore, but he still had to go to the physical. That evening, Elliott pushed the door open. In his arms, he carried an exquisitely wrapped bouquet of forget-me-nots, and in his other hand, he held that out, of print blue and white porcelain tea set. The warm glow of the early evening sun pierced through the windows, refracting off the smooth, lustrous glaze, making the entire scene look as beautifully flawless as an illusion. Elliott arched a triumphant brow, tapping his own lips to demand his reward. Angus' gaze followed the movement, landing on those deep red lips. In a flash, his mind transported him back to the dim terrace, to that dark red, viscous phantom entangled with the taste of red wine. A violent wave of nausea hit his stomach. Angus abruptly turned away, setting the tea set down onto the walnut coffee table. The porcelain struck the wood with a sharp, crisp clink. "Let's eat." He lowered his lashes, his jaw locked tight as he avoided that gaze completely. Elliott didn't sense anything wrong. He stepped up behind Angus, dominantly wrapping his arms around his waist. As he closed in, a faint, deeply oppressive dark golden dust flared in the air, raining down like scorching sparks against the back of Angus' neck. That feather-light kiss caused Angus' spine to snap rigidly straight. Sitting before a table full of steaming, exquisite dishes, he kept his head bowed. A self-mocking smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Every bite tasted like ash. The mornings that followed simply repeated themselves in the golden dawn. Standing before the full-length mirror in the walk-in closet, Angus' long fingers moved deftly, quietly tying Elliott's tie. Angus was a ceramicist. When he met Elliott, he was walking home, cradling his very first piece. Crash! A man covered in blood and grime had slammed violently into his chest. Amidst the sharp shatter of the clay pot, that massive trouble named Elliott crashed right into Angus' ordinary life. Elliott was an illegitimate son, deep in the treacherous trenches of a family power struggle. The down and out alpha completely retracted his terrifying domination, lounging on the beta's narrow bed like a wicked, massive feline. With his sculpted, muscular chest exposed, he leaned in through the narrow, warm, toned halo. A bewitching light flickered deep within his fathomless eyes as he half-jokingly, half-earnestly murmured about paying off his debts with his body. Angus didn't pull away. The scorching heat of the muscle beneath his fingertips and the devastatingly handsome face hovering so close were more than enough to make any ordinary beta completely surrender in that faint light, until the deafening crack of a gunshot ripped the night apart. To save Elliott, Angus took a bullet to his right arm. From that day on, the right hand that had once been as steady as a rock would uncontrollably, violently spasm and tremble in the clay. Under the glaring light, the mangled, distorted clay vessel looked agonizingly pathetic. The towering alpha pulled him into a desperate, crushing embrace from behind, searing tears crashing down into the crook of Angus' mud-stained neck. The ghostly blue light radiating from Elliott flickered and shattered like a mourning cry. "I'm so sorry. I ruined your dream." Later, the blood and grime were washed away, replaced by the immaculate bespoke suits of a true power broker. Carrying a massive bouquet of blooming forget-me-nots, Elliott pulled Angus into the dazzling, brilliant world of a penthouse mansion. 7 years of lavish extravagance flashed by like fleeting shadows. Angus thought he had finally forgotten that within this gilded cage, he had only ever been that ordinary, unremarkable beta. Angus' fingertips paused for a fraction of a second. From a row of perfectly color-coordinated ties, he calmly pulled out a dark green tie that violently clashed with the bespoke suit, meticulously tying it tight around the man's neck. The alpha, consumed by power and desire, didn't notice the jarring visual clash at his collar at all. He leaned down, the dominant, dark, golden halo surging forward once again, practically threatening to swallow the man before him whole. "I'm off to work. Wait for me to come home." Angus gently pushed against the suffocating phantom of light. His gaze drifted right past the alpha's broad shoulders, landing on the sea of flowers swaying in the morning breeze outside the window. "Have a safe trip," he said flatly. He didn't utter the familiar "I'll be waiting," because behind this door, there would no longer be a bottomless, endless wait. The next day, inside the Differentiation Center's ultrasound clinic, the fluorescent lights cast a clean, soft warmth. On the color ultrasound screen, a shadow with clearly defined edges pulsed rhythmically. "It's recovering beautifully," Bet said, pointing at the shadow on the screen with a warm smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "The light particle traces in your blood are already starting to manifest. Soon, you'll be able to stably capture the visual spectrum of pheromones. Within a year, you'll have everything you wished for." Angus stared quietly at the phantom shadow, representing hope, yet the depths of his eyes were a pool of dead, rippleless calm. He pulled his lips into an incredibly shallow, faint smile. "No." I threw the differentiation pills away. Bet looked at him in stark confusion, gently setting the chart down on the desk. "Why stop the medication so suddenly? The differentiation traits that have already manifested want disappear. You can't go back." My partner found his fated Omega. Angus' tone was as light as a passing breeze. A heavy silence descended on the room. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, projecting alternating bars of light and dark across Betta's pristine white uniform. She let out a long sigh. Picking up a pen, she pressed down hard, slashing a stark red annotation across the experimental logbook. Trial terminated. Angus, go be yourself. Believe it or not, betas are actually far freer than alphas and omegas. Angus stood up. Facing the warm sun pouring through the window, he gave a sincere, grateful bow. Walking out of the clinic, the end of the corridor was a massive wall of floor, ceiling glass. He stopped, looking at the solitary beta reflected in the glass. For 7 years, his entire world had been reduced to nothing but Elliott. And now, the dark golden shadow that had completely eclipsed his sky had finally been scattered by his own hands. The golden sunlight poured over his entire body without a single obstruction. He raised his right hand, the one that used to tremble too much to hold clay, and in the brilliant natural light his fingertips slowly, completely unfurled. The warm amber sunset sliced the deep alleyway into stark halves of light and dark, casting a nostalgic soft glow over the brick walls that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The pottery shop that used to be there had been replaced by an elegantly lit, neon-washed bar. Angus stood at the mouth of the alley. Before he could even pull himself out of the faint melancholy of a world moved on, a frantic, scrambling silhouette shattered the light and shadows before him. A young boy dressed as a waiter stumbled blindly forward. The exact second he brushed past Angus' shoulder, a thick, sickeningly sweet neon pink dust violently exploded in the air. A group of alphas, their eyes crawling with crimson blood vessels, cursed loudly as they chased after him. Like beasts entirely stripped of their sanity, they greedily tracked the incredibly visible, blazing pink trail of light suspended in the air. Where did that little O run off to? Angus Adams apple-bobbed slightly. His finger pointed toward the fork on the left. Only after watching the alphas sprint madly down the wrong path and disappear did he slowly loosen his clenched fist. He felt as though he had tangibly grasped the freedom Bet spoke of, wrapped completely in that intoxicating pink dust. His world remained absolutely, terrifyingly calm. He turned around and, following the lingering brilliant pink ribbon of light, walked into the deepest shadows of the alley. At the very end of the pink trail lay a dead end completely swallowed by the dark. "Brother Elliott, someone induced me." The boy threw himself into the man's arms. His upturned face looked devastatingly pitiful against the faint backlight. Angus froze in his tracks. In the gloom, Elliott's tense jawline radiated a sharp, lethal fury. "Didn't I tell you to quit that garbage job?" With Elliott's heavy, ragged breaths, massive patches of freezing light, a violent collision of ghostly blue and violet erupted aggressively from his towering back. The freezing light climbed rapidly like thorny vines, completely covering the mottled brick wall. Carrying an absolute crushing domination, it instantly suppressed and drowned the sweet pink dust swirling around the boy. That was the color and scent of forget-me-nots. That was the color and scent that had accompanied Angus for 7 long years. Hidden in the shadows of the corner, Angus slowly raised his phone. With trembling fingertips he pressed record. On the screen the boy clung to Elliott's shoulders in a hazy daze. The corners of his eyes flushed a fragile red. "I love you, older brother. I love you so much." Elliott's footsteps stopped dead. Caught on camera, he pinned the boy against the rough wall with a single arm. His long fingers clamped ruthlessly around the boy's chin. Heavy with punishment and a total loss of control, he crashed down into a brutal, consuming kiss. In an instant, the freezing blue light and the sweet pink dust violently tangled and detonated around them, illuminating the once dark dead end in a surreal, dazzling explosion of color. Pat! A single crystal clear drop of water crashed onto the phone screen, instantly blurring the tangled halo of light captured in the frame. Angus slowly lifted his head. The sky was burning with the brilliant, gorgeous colors of the sunset. It turned out the rain was only falling from his eyes. As night fell, the phone screen cast a harsh, frigid white glow. Elliott's low voice drifted through the receiver, thick with a feigned apology. "Baby Im, working late tonight. I won't be coming home." Angus hung up the phone, his face an unreadable mask. He sold off every single luxury item Elliott had ever given him. 7 years of his youth and his shattered boundaries were reduced to nothing but cold, hard numbers. In that rapidly emptying room, he executed their final, undignified liquidation. 3 days later, The frigid morning light bled into the entryway, utterly devoid of warmth. The heavy door swung open, and Elliott strode in. His once immaculate, bespoke suit was rumpled, the midnight blue tie hanging loose and crooked around his neck. He carelessly shoved a velvet watch box into Angus' arms before dropping his chin exhaustedly into the crook of Angus' neck. His arms locked in a tight embrace around him. 3 straight days of overtime. I'm exhausted. Let me just recharge for a minute. Yet, as he drew close, a blindingly harsh smear of pink dust stubbornly clung to the fibers of his suit jacket, tangling sickeningly with the exhausted blue aura radiating from his body. Angus' eyelashes violently shuddered, his heart seizing as if crushed in a vice grip, fighting down the overwhelming urge to violently shove that filthy phantom light away. He lowered his red, rimmed eyes, burying every drop of his emotion. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the lapel of Elliott's suit. Then let me draw you a bath. The lazy smile on Elliott's lips instantly froze. He clamped his hand down over Angus, smoothly and flawlessly pulling his jacket collar tight. But in the split second his arm lifted, the collar of his dress shirt gaped just enough. A slender, raw, blood-red scratch lay utterly exposed, glaring right into Angus' line of sight. Let's skip it. Your husband is just too tired. Elliott tapped the tip of Angus' nose in a practiced, masking gesture, burying a flicker of panic beneath a sickeningly doting fake smile. There is a porcelain exhibition in a couple of days. It'll take you. Angus just stared at him quietly. Those eyes, which used to overflow with unconditional love, were now a pool of dead water, incapable of reflecting a single ray of light. Angus' voice was completely devoid of inflection. He looked at that breathtakingly handsome face and spoke in a feather, light murmur. Do you know what I hate the most? Elliott laughed, raising a hand. His fingertips traced a few frivolous ripples of light in the air. It can't possibly be me. I swear it'll really go with you. If lying, a dog. Angus looked at that hand, swearing its hollow oath. He slowly slipped his fingertips out of Elliott's grip. Taking half a step back, he entirely removed himself from that nauseating halo of light. An incredibly frigid, desolate smile pulled at the corner of his mouth as he enunciated every single word. I absolutely loathe liars. For the next few days, the air in the villa was unnervingly clear. That profoundly dominant, ghostly blue, violet light belonging to Elliott seemed to have evaporated into thin air. It wasn't until he stepped under the vaulted ceilings of the porcelain exhibition hall that Angus finally found the answer hidden within the shifting lights and shadows. In the expansive hall, alphas and omegas wove through the crowd. The air was thick with a chaotic, murky spectrum of glowing dust, some flaring with an aggressive, vicious crimson, others radiating a sickly sweet, languid tangerine. They collided and grinded against each other in mid-air, like invisible neon signs, stubbornly refusing to dissipate. Yet, amidst this chaotic visual storm, an absolute vacuum surrounded the boy wearing the Oliver name tag. Beneath his fresh, choppy fringe, his round eyes looked as innocent as ever. But when he bowed to greet the guests, the harsh spotlights illuminated his snow-white nape. Stamped right into the flesh was a perfectly uniform, deeply embedded ring of healed bite marks. A permanent mark. That cruel, deeply possessive ring of teeth marks acted as an absolute, unbreakable lock, completely sealing the boy's sickeningly sweet pink dust deep inside his body. It was why he could walk so freely through an exhibition hall packed with alphas, rendered entirely invisible, a piece of property with its ownership violently and undeniably declared. Elliott's bespoke leather shoes hitched on the polished tiles for an imperceptible half-second. His expression didn't waver as he accompanied Angus through the exhibits, right up until the halfway mark, when he excused himself to the restroom. Angus followed the cool, toned sconces down the corridor. In a blind spot hidden from the security cameras, Elliott had Oliver pinned ruthlessly into the shadows. Drop the petty schemes. The muscle in Elliott's jaw ticked, wound agonizingly tight. Don't think for a second that having this mark makes you untouchable. If Angus finds out, I don't care if you're my fated Omega. I will find someone to scrub this mark right off your skin. Oliver's frail shoulders shook violently, tears rapidly pooling in his eyes. It's a school volunteer event. I need the credits. I had no idea you were coming. You never tell me anything. Why do you always think the worst of me? He shoved hard against Elliott's broad chest, clamping a hand over his mouth as he bolted out of the shadows. With tears shimmering at the corners of his eyes, The boy brushed right past Angus, who was standing quietly around the corner. Elliott stood frozen in place. He took a deep breath, forcefully shoving the violent, freezing blue light raging around him back beneath his skin. He turned around and stepped out of the shadows. The second their gazes collided, the Alpha's pupils contracted violently. The mask of absolute composure on his face shattered instantly, sheer panic bleeding into his expression. "Baby, when did you get here?" Angus leaned lazily against the marble wall. There was no fury. There were no interrogations. He simply tilted his chin up, gesturing faintly in the direction the boy had fled. "Aren't you going to chase him?" "Listen to me. Let me explain." Between us, Elliott took a desperate step forward. "It's fine. I understand." Angus raised a hand, brutally and cleanly cutting him off. He tilted his head slightly, putting on the exact same obedient, deeply devoted look he had worn for the last 7 years. A self-mocking smile pulled at his lips. "You need an heir, and I can't give you one. I have no choice but to accept that you'll have a child with an Omega." Elliott stared at him in absolute horror, his breathing turning ragged. A bitter, vicious laugh tore from his lips. "Is that what you think? Then what the hell am I to you? Do you really think my devotion to you is something I can just slice up and hand out to someone else?" "He means absolutely nothing to me." Angus only found it profoundly absurd. He didn't even spare a second glance at that face, twisted in defensive rage. He just calmly raised his hand, lightly patting the Alpha's rigid shoulder. In going back to the exhibition, when they returned home that day, Elliott inexplicably initiated a cold war. "I'll come back to our room when you realize you were wrong." Elliott dropped the ultimatum and slammed the door on his way out, trailing a freezing aura in his wake. Angus stood alone in the living room, bathed in the morning light. For the first time, he felt like he could finally breathe. That very night, under the warm amber glow of the study lamp, a few pages of crisp black and white text, a meticulously typed divorce agreement, sat perfectly aligned on the desk. The next afternoon, sunlight pierced through the floor, 2 ceiling windows of the cafe. Oliver sat in the wicker chair opposite him, idly stirring his latte art. The facade of innocent ignorance had been completely stripped away, replaced by the arrogant entitlement of youth. "I heard you can accept my existence." The boy tilted his chin up slightly, the sunlight catching the naked contempt in his eyes. "There is no need to play games and pretend to step back. You are just an ordinary beta, and I am his fated Omega. You simply took advantage of being born 10 years earlier to hoard my Alpha. Sooner or later, he will return to my side." Angus sat quietly in the halo of light, not uttering a single word. He had originally thought the boy was a pitiful victim manipulated by pheromones. Now he saw him for what he truly was, an arrogant, spoiled co-conspirator. Angus lowered his eyes, his gaze landing on his steaming cup of coffee. The scalding dark brown liquid swayed slightly in the porcelain cup. Throw it at him or drink it. 2 seconds later, the bottom of the cup met the tabletop with a heavy, sharp clink. Angus abruptly stood up. His right hand violently whipped upward, carving a powerful, blinding blur through the air. Smack! Smack! 2 crisp, echoing slaps landed flawlessly on the boy's arrogant face. The sheer force snapped Oliver's head to the side, 2 glaring crimson handprints instantly blooming across his snow-white skin. Interfering in someone else's marriage is cheap. Angus looked down at the boy, whose eyes were now red with furious disbelief. Angus' voice was absolute ice, devoid of a single degree of warmth. "Doing something this disgusting, and then daring to run up to my face to show off, is a level of cheapness that knows no bounds." Angus turned around, taking long strides straight into the blinding sunlight. "I wish you 2 pieces of trash a long, miserable life together." The moonlight was smothered by heavy clouds. The villa was so dead silent you could hear the dust hit the floor. Angus shoved his ID and a few basic changes of clothes into a worn canvas duffel bag. He didn't take a single thing that carried Elliott's trace. In the freezing midnight wind, he took a shovel out to the back garden. He uprooted every single forget-me, not the symbol of their eternal love, and buried them all deep within the damp, freezing mud, leaving not a single trace of color behind. On the walnut coffee table in the living room lay a solitary silver USB drive and a crisp black and white divorce agreement. The roar of a red-eye flight, a rattling bus, a muddy and violently shaking motorcycle. The light and shadows constantly receded as the scenery outside the window changed. When the first coarse rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist of the mountain forest, Angus had returned to Mount Qingyun. Deep in these mountains, there were no chaotic pheromone light motes, no alphas, and no omegas. The old house was already overgrown with dark green moss. The mildew on the wooden door exuded a stale scent in the sun. For 3 full days he worked tirelessly amidst the dust and dampness, until a fire finally crackled in the hearth, bringing the warmth of the living back into the dim old house. Meanwhile, when Elliott watched Oliver run over crying with a swollen red face to complain, the violent beast in his heart bizarrely calmed down. Instead, a wave of secret, hidden ecstasy surged within him. Angus cared about him. Those 2 slaps were the absolute best proof. He had spent 10 whole years fighting his alpha instincts, rejecting the seduction of countless omegas, all just to love an ordinary beta. What gave Angus the right to accept him and Oliver together, so casually? Didn't that just prove Angus' love wasn't deep enough? That was exactly why he had used the Cold War to force his hand. See? It only took 1 day for his beta to bare his jealous fangs. Elliott ignored Oliver's tears. Humming a light tune, he pushed open the door to his home, carrying a fresh bouquet of forget-me-nots. There were no approaching footsteps to welcome him. The empty living room bled a dead, absolute silence. He placed the forget-me-nots into that expensive antique vase and pulled out his phone to dial. Beep! The dial tone echoed in the hollow room. Angus had no friends. Where could he possibly go? He was definitely just sulking at some porcelain exhibition in a mall. 3 consecutive calls went unanswered. Elliott's gaze finally landed on the coffee table. The moment he saw the divorce agreement, it felt as though an icy hand had ruthlessly crushed his heart. He bolted up to the 2nd floor in a panic and threw open the walk-in closet doors. Seeing all the exquisite clothes and expensive watches still sitting quietly in their exact places, he let out a long, heavy breath of relief. He didn't take them. He was just throwing a tantrum. A little coaxing would fix it. He knew Angus. He returned to the living room and plugged the silver USB drive into his laptop. The first thing to pop up was a pitch-black audio file, carrying the noisy background chatter of the clubhouse rooftop. The only reason I'm keeping him around is that I'm 30. My darling, after all, can't give me one. Next was a blindingly harsh video. In the dim mouth of an alley, the violent entanglement of pink dust and freezing blue-violet light. A close-up of him pinning the boy against the wall, kissing him ruthlessly. Finally, there were a few lines of freezing white text on a pitch-black background. Elliott, the reason I could accept you being with someone else is that I planned on walking away. I told you. I absolutely loathe liars. You always said you loved me by fighting your instincts. Thinking about it now, that phrase could also just mean, instinctively, you don't love me. Sign the divorce agreement. Let's give everyone a shred of dignity. Lastly, I hate forget-me-nots. Elliott's eyes instantly flooded with blood, a vicious crimson spreading across the whites. No. He loved Angus. He loved his elegant, serene eyes, loved his absolute focus when making pottery, loved his ruthless determination when he took a bullet for him. But he was an alpha. The exact second he met his fated Omega, it was like a high, explosive bomb was dropped into his brain. All reason instantly collapsed, leaving nothing but the primal instinct to bond. It was a curse carved right into his DNA. What else was he supposed to do? Like a trapped beast, Elliott frantically began dialing every single number of anyone who might possibly know Angus. Finally, he stormed into the differentiation center where Bet worked. However, Bet merely gave him a freezing side glance, slamming a heavy experimental logbook and a stack of color ultrasound reports onto her desk. While he was enduring agonizing pain testing experimental drugs, desperately trying to carry a child for you, you chose to let an Omega bear your heir. Bet's voice was as cold as ice. He had already begun to capture the visual spectrum of your pheromones. Aside from attempting to alter his biology purely for your sake, he never contacted me on his own. I have no idea where he went. Elliott stared dead at the slowly clarifying shadow of a gestational sac on the ultrasound. A painful, agonizing hiss tore from his throat. If only he had known. If only he had just held back a little longer, they would have had a child. When he returned to the villa like a wandering ghost, he finally noticed that every single forget-me, not in the back garden, had been uprooted, reduced to an absolute barren wasteland. And that heavily cracked clay pot, the one he had so carefully cherished and preserved, was shattered once again into a floor full of unsalvageable, powdery dust. 1 week later, Mount Qingyun. The air deep in the mountains was frigid and clean. Angus sat in the dusty courtyard looking at the old pottery wheel. Between his already stiff right hand and his rusty skills, the clay vessel he threw came out lopsided and warped. More importantly, there was no high-temperature kiln in the mountains. He hitched a ride into the city on a village elder's sputtering, rattling tricycle. The fading glow of the setting sun spilled into the depths of an old alleyway, where a rustic-looking pottery shop sat with its door half open. The owner was a young man with endearing canine teeth named Cheney. "My kiln is out in the suburbs. Use it as much as you want, free of charge." When Cheney smiled, he radiated a clean, sun-warmed temperature. There aren't many young people interested in this kind of thing anymore. I'm just happy to have someone to share the anticipation of waiting for the porcelain to come out of the kiln. "You're pretty young yourself." Looking at his old soul demeanor, Angus couldn't help but laugh. Over the course of a few weeks, the blazing kiln fires rose again and again. When they opened the kiln for the third time, Angus and Cheney looked at the pile of misshapen, ugly things in their hands. They glanced at each other's dirt, smeared faces, and burst into uncontrollable laughter. "Sorry about that. It's just been too long," Angus said, rolling his faintly aching wrist. "It's fine. Good things take time." Cheney flashed his canine teeth, his eyes brimming with encouragement. Looking at the imperfect ceramic piece in his hands, a relaxed smile curved on Angus' lips. "I'll take them back and give them to the villagers." Not only would they not mind the flaws, but they would enthusiastically praise him for it. Here, he was no longer someone's accessory. He no longer needed to desperately capture those fleeting, ethereal light motes. He belonged only to himself. On the battered wooden table, his phone screen flashed wildly. Through the receiver, Elliott's voice sounded as if it had been ruthlessly ground down by coarse sandpaper, bleeding a bone, dry despair. "I'll sign it. Just come back." The thin morning mist was torn apart by the roar of a pickup truck's engine. Cheney gripped the steering wheel, the warm sun piercing through the window to gild the edge of his smiling profile. "I'm heading that way to set up an exhibition anyway. It's a perfect excuse to drop you off." The tires rolled over the winding mountain roads, rapidly peeling away the lush, endless green of Mount Qingyun, instantly swapping it for the cold, blinding glass facades of the downtown district. On the cold white steps outside the Civil Affairs Bureau, Elliott stood like a hollow shell drained of all moisture. His once towering, imposing frame was shockingly gaunt. His eye sockets were sunken in, and his bloodshot pupils locked in a death grip onto Angus as he stepped out of Cheney's truck. "That guy just now, is he an alpha?" Elliott's voice was pulled so tight it sounded like a bowstring about to snap. Angus didn't so much as flutter an eyelash. He walked straight toward the entrance. "That has nothing to do with you. Let's do the paperwork and part on good terms." His wrist was abruptly seized by an incredibly brutal force. With red-rimmed eyes, Elliott lowered his head. His trembling lips pressed in a desperate, almost pleading kiss against the faded old scar on Angus' wrist bone, the scar left from taking a bullet for him. Can we not divorce? I've already had someone scrub Oliver's mark off." Boom. With the complete collapse of the Alpha's emotional dam, an overwhelming, ghostly blue-violet light violently erupted from Elliott's core like a desperate tsunami. It tried to completely envelop Angus in a posture that was simultaneously pathetic and absolutely possessive. "You can see my pheromones now. I'll only show them to you." Smack. A resounding sharp slap exploded across the empty steps. Angus violently ripped his hand back, taking 2 steps away. He raised a hand to cover his nose and mouth. "I'm sorry, it's just too blinding. I'm not used to it. I told you, I absolutely loathe liars. If you're lying to me again this time, well, just have to go through the legal system." Elliott's head was knocked to the side, a glaring red handprint instantly blooming across his cheek. Like a drowning man, he didn't dare to look back up for a long time. Finally, his lips trembling violently, he backed down in absolute miserable defeat. Then, "Can we still be friends? We can start over. You can use me. You love porcelain? I'll host solo exhibitions for you for the rest of your life." Angus looked at him quietly. Through that shattered, fractured blue light, the image of that ugly clay pot, the one that had been barely patched together with gold powder, floated into his mind. "Elliott, do you remember the first time we met? When you shattered my clay pot?" Angus' voice was as light as a breeze, yet every single word was a lethal strike to the heart. "You didn't like it, but because it was my very first piece, you felt obligated to patch it up with gold powder for me. Later, I used it to hold the flowers you gave me, but the flowers always withered so fast. because I eventually realized that, without me noticing, the water had completely leaked out of that broken pot a long time ago. Flowers without roots will wither. A shattered clay pot, no matter how much gold powder you fill it with, can never hold water again. And an insincere person, no matter how much they weep and beg, can never wash away the stain on their soul. The clay pot, the flowers, and you, I don't want any of it anymore. Elliott's face went deathly pale. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and held it up to Angus. The screen played a video of his hands, covered in blood, painstakingly piecing together the shattered ceramic shards. What if I fix the pot again? Angus barely spared a passing glance at that futile imagery before looking away. Can it really be fixed? Struck as if by lightning, Elliott lost his voice entirely. The steel seal slammed down heavily, and 2 divorce certificates were pushed across the desk. The clerk muttered in unfazed, couples just never learn, instantly igniting Elliott's frayed nerves. He roared in furious primal rage like a beast guarding its kill. And yet, amidst his out-of-control bellowing, Angus picked up his own certificate without a single ounce of hesitation. Pushing open the heavy glass doors, he took long, purposeful strides, straight into the brilliant, blazing sunlight. In the tea room, Bet smiled as she pushed the bank cards back to Angus, raising her teacup to toast his newfound freedom. 3 days later, his phone screen lit up with a long string of numbers, a massive compensation transfer from Elliott. A week later, that staggering wealth was transformed into the weather, beaming smile of the village chief and the roaring construction of a smooth asphalt road paving its way up Mount Kingyun. Warm amber spotlights cascaded down like waterfalls inside the art exhibition hall. Piece after piece of brilliantly colored, uniquely shaped porcelain flowed with a gentle, lustrous sheen beneath the shifting light and shadows. Angus stood quietly before a display stand, looking at the man beside him, Cheney, the highly renowned young master ceramicist. Into the kiln as one color, out of the kiln in 10,000 colors. They are all beautiful. Cheney flashed his signature endearing canine tooth, his gaze warm and bright. The very first time I saw you, I knew you were my senior brother. Master always said your hand was injured. I thought you would never make pottery again. A soft halo of light fell upon Angus' right hand, still bearing its old scar. He gently raised his fingertips, tracing the air above a kiln, altered clay pot before him, one that wasn't perfectly symmetrical, yet radiated a distinct, vibrant vitality. Those suffocating, oppressive blue-violet light spots and that hypocritical gold powder had all been left entirely behind in the shadows of the past. Angus' eyes curved slightly, a completely liberated, pure smile blooming on his lips. Life doesn't have to be perfect, and neither does porcelain. Cheney turned his head, facing the brightest beam of light in the hall. His voice was clear and free. Art isn't that unforgiving. The soft lighting at the entrance of the exhibition hall was suddenly and brutally sliced apart by a chaotic, visual block of color. Angus followed Cheney's lead and looked toward the noise. Clusters of manic, freezing blue, violet light were wrapping around a messy cloud of pink dust, like iron chains. The veins on Elliott's temples bulged as he dragged Oliver, who was wearing a volunteer uniform, toward the glass doors. Who told you to come here? Get the hell out. The boy's eyes were rimmed red. He struggled desperately, the suppressed pink halo around him, trembling violently with his cries. My mentor recommended me for this. What does it have to do with you? This isn't your exhibition. What gives you the right to kick me out? Cheney calmly stepped into the boundary of that blinding light, using his straight, tall back to block the tyrannical blue aura. Excuse me, this is my exhibition. Please keep your voice down. Elliott's gaze shot right over Cheney's shoulder, pinning itself dead onto Angus standing behind him. The hand gripping Oliver abruptly lost all its strength. The violently raging blue, violet light spots around him froze in an instant. I knew you would come, he muttered to himself, his eyes rapidly crawling with the bloodshot red of pure jealousy. He violently pointed at Cheney, a contemptuous sneer tearing at his lips. You came with him? Has nothing but a beta? No matter how promising he is, he can't compare to me. Angus stood quietly beneath the warm amber spotlights, watching the alpha descend into madness. He wasn't angry. Instead, a deeply faint, lucid smile rippled across his lips. So that's what you think? But Elliott, I'm also nothing but a beta. The madness in Elliott's eyes was instantly replaced by sheer panic. He took a frantic step forward, the blue light around him fracturing and shattering. That's not what I meant. Angus, you're different. It's all the same. Angus' voice was so steady there wasn't a single ripple, his eyes clear straight to the bottom. If it were anyone else back then, I would have saved them too. Just like that day in the alley, I followed that trail of light in the air because I wanted to save Oliver, who had been induced into a heat. I didn't go there to catch you cheating. He paused for a second, looking at the two people completely frozen in place. It just so happened that I realized he didn't need my saving at all. Ignoring those two faces that had instantly drained of all color, Angus turned his head and gave Cheney a slight nod. You handle this. I'm going to continue viewing the exhibition. He turned around, walking with steady, unhesitating steps toward the most brilliant light source deep within the hall. That was the very last time he ever saw Elliott. From this day forward, their paths diverged into light and shadow, each finding their own peace. Extra, Elliott. The heavy curtains of the villa were drawn tight. Inside the pitch-black room, the floor was littered with empty wine bottles refracting a freezing light. Just get together with Oliver. You two are fated anyway. His friend's persuasions were like venomous thorns. Elliott smashed his phone, severing every last line of communication. Until one day, the front door was pushed open. A massive, overwhelmingly intense wave of pink dust, carrying an absolute domination, violently flooded into the darkness. Oliver stood looking down at him from the light, his tone flat, impregnant. There wasn't a single ripple in Elliott's dead eyes, only pure disgust. Have the child, and it'll give you money. As for me, don't even think about it. Ha 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 ha. The boy suddenly burst into manic laughter, his whole body trembling. He advanced step by step, backing Elliott into a corner. In your dreams. I already aborted it. Someone like you doesn't deserve to have an heir. It felt as if his heart had been brutally ripped open by a dull knife. Elliott's eyes burned crimson, a feral beast, like roar tearing from his throat. If this person hadn't suddenly appeared during his rut, how could he have ever lost Angus? He lunged forward violently, his hands reaching out, wanting to crush the boy's neck. However, the very second he moved, boom! Hundreds, thousands of tangible pink halos explosively detonated from within Oliver. The sanity of an alpha instantly crumbled into dust before this faded visual spectrum. Elliott's brain plunged into a hazy fog. Oliver crouched down, his long fingertips mockingly patting the alpha's deathly pale cheek. The pink dust danced across his fingertips. Look at you. You alphas are born this pathetic, yet you act so high and mighty, preaching about your deep devotion. The boy stood up. Stepping over the wreckage scattered across the floor, he turned and left without a single shred of hesitation. The pink dust was entirely siphoned away the moment the door clicked shut. The endless darkness surged back in like a rising tide, swallowing Elliott whole as he knelt in the absolute center of his ruined life. Beside him, there was absolutely no one. Extra, Cheney. 10 years ago in the old pottery workshop, Cheney had gazed across the crowded room countless times, his eyes fixed on the senior brother who pursued color with an absolute, grueling perfectionism. But back then, an overwhelmingly oppressive, ghostly blue cold light always imprisoned Angus in an inescapable grip. As a beta, Cheney understood that terrifying possessiveness all too well. He quietly retracted his gaze, withdrawing into the safety of the shadows. He never expected that 10 years later, he would see his senior brother push open the door to his own shop. The days that followed compressed rapidly amidst the blazing, scorching heat of the kiln. There was no unnecessary probing, no messy entanglement. It took Cheney 3 full years to finally help Angus unfurl his fingertips once more in the warm, healing glow of the kiln fire. Their hands intertwined tightly amidst the splashing clay and water. As the tongues of fire surged and roared, a set of pure, fiercely passionate Langyao, red porcelain was born from the flames. In their second year together, a paper-thin ultrasound report violently tore through their warm, peaceful life. The gestational sac was merely a few millimeters, but it carried a freezing, absolute diagnosis, incomplete transformation, extremely high mortality risk. Angus wanted to try. Cheney absolutely refused. To Cheney, there was nothing in this world more important than Angus. In the dim amber bedroom, the shadows from the ceiling lamps swayed violently against the walls. Angus curled into the corner of the bed, his eyes rimmed a furious red. Massive tears crashed down as he shielded his flat stomach in a death grip, thrashing with hysterical, desperate resistance. A single, scalding tear fell from Cheney's bloodshot eyes without a shred of warning, shattering against the hardwood floor. The warm orange halo of the bedside lamp enveloped him completely. There was no terrifying, absolute domination woven from an alpha's pheromones here, only the most silent, yet utterly indestructible devotion and protective heartache of an ordinary man. Seeing Cheney's falling tears, Angus' violently trembling shoulders instantly froze. Bathed in the room's heartbreakingly warm light, his desperate cries ceased. He obediently lowered his tear-soaked eyelashes in absolute surrender. From that night on, every single time Cheney pulled the man tightly into his crushing embrace, he meticulously took every precaution. His Angus was meant only to smile within the warm, gentle light. He would never again need to shed a single tear for any kind of suffering in this lifetime. When the morning sunlight poured in, unreservedly illuminating Angus' flawless, smooth nape once more, Cheney leaned in and pressed a deeply tender kiss against his skin.
And with that, the story comes to an end. I truly adore Angus. Even though he is just an ordinary, unremarkable beta, he possesses an absolute clarity of mind and a profoundly deep love. When it comes to his lover, he holds absolutely nothing back. He is willing to take a bullet for him, and even willing to alter his own biology for him. Yet, he has his own unbreakable bottom line. Upon discovering the betrayal, he didn't break down, he didn't launch into hysterical interrogations, and he certainly didn't wallow in self-pity. He displayed an admirable courage and dignity. He calmly documented the evidence of the affair, cleanly and decisively liquidated their assets, and walked away from the man he had loved for 7 years without a single shred of mercy. Angus may seem ordinary, but he harbors a massive, quiet strength within him. He is like a sunflower, warm and capable of growing all on his own as long as he has the sun. In the end, Angus met Cheney. Unlike Elliott's arrogance and condescending charity, Cheney is gentle and deeply respectful. He healed Angus' trauma with his silent, steadfast companionship. The two of them together feel like a normal, everyday marriage, ordinary, yet incredibly happy. Meanwhile, Elliott parades his fight against his instincts as a badge of his deep devotion, yet simultaneously uses those exact same instincts as a grandiose, self-righteous excuse to cheat. He wants Angus' unwavering loyalty and companionship, but he also wants Oliver to satisfy his primal desires and need for novelty. When Angus finally exposed him, his first reaction wasn't to try and salvage the relationship, but to shift the blame entirely onto Angus. Even after being together for 10 years, Elliott never truly took the time to understand the kind of person Angus really was. He even attempted to use a Cold War to force Angus to crawl back to him. It's absolutely laughable. My feelings about Oliver are incredibly complicated. I absolutely do not condone his interference in someone else's marriage. But I have to admit, Oliver is an incredibly brilliant guy. He is a master at weaponizing his gender advantages, and he knows exactly what the fatal flaws of those arrogant alphas are. Because of this, Oliver can effortlessly orchestrate the exact outcome he desires. When Elliott scrubbed away his mark, Oliver aborted the child without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering attachment. He knew the child no longer held any leverage, and he knew that doing this would deal Elliott the most devastating, crushing blow. Oliver doesn't love anyone. He is only in it for himself. Even though he is a villain, he leaves an absolutely unforgettable impression.